most people, many people at least, probably don't know a whole lot about how accreditation works, why it's here. Maybe they don't even know that it's going on at their college or university. And that's a major reason that we're having this discussion today, is hopefully to sort of raise the consciousness about what accreditation is and what the threats may be to it and through it, and maybe what positive functions it can have in higher education. Now, I'm not involved though, or I'm not uninvolved, or as uninvolved as I am, because I think it's too esoteric, or because I'm lazy, although laziness always plays a part in what I do or don't do. It's because I haven't spent as much time on it because I think there's a deeper root problem that affects accreditation in all of higher education. And again, Doug mentioned it. And I think that this root problem will prevent major reform, meaningful reform, especially lasting reform, from occurring for accreditation or any other higher education quality control. And that is the federal funding of students. Federal student aid, I think, is our root problem. And of course, people are likely to disagree with that, and that's going to be part of the fun, I hope, of today's event. As you've heard, and you're no doubt going to hear some more, accreditation has, at least over time, assumed this major gatekeeping role for federal dollars. If you want to get federal student aid, and almost every institution takes federal student aid, you have to go, as an institution, you have to be accredited. That's the only way that money can go there. And that money is substantial. So let me just try and put that into some context. In 1970, using inflation-adjusted dollars, total federal aid, including grants, loans, tax credits, et cetera, and there's lots of federal aid, it accumulated to about $19 billion. So that's billion, that's pretty big. You know, so even today, billion still means something. But by 1995, so 25 years later, it had ballooned to $52 billion, again, inflation-adjusted numbers. And by 2012, it had hit $170 billion. And $170 billion, even to the federal government, is still a pretty substantial amount of money. And so you can see this major federal investment that accreditors are helping to make sure is used, or try to make sure is used wisely. Now, of course, a lot of that growth is because you had big increases in enrollment. But even on a per pupil basis, you see major increases in aid. So between 1990 and 2012, federal aid per full-time equivalent student rose from $3,143 to $9,445, so nearly a tripling on a per pupil basis. So the job of accreditors, it seems, in the federal system is essentially to put a seal of approval on schools, sort of that good housekeeper seal of approval, so that federal dollars can then flow to that institution. That raises, though, some immediate problems, and I think the problems that we're going to try and focus on. What happens, for instance, when a school or an entire sector of schools does something wrong, or does something politically unfashionable? So I think that, arguably, of course, but I think you can conclude that a lot of the focus on for-profits, while there are lots of problems in the for-profit sector, much of it seems to be driven by more of an ideological animus to profit in higher ed. It's certainly not the only explanation. And that's largely political. How, if we have federal money going to colleges, do we avoid that sort of political-driven policymaking, especially if there's a lot of federal money involved? Would we expect, if you have some big headline problem in a school that is already accredited, that politicians will just leave accreditation alone to say, do what you were originally intended to do. Work collegially with the institutions that are your members so that you can work together to improve. Or will they say, now we need to have compliance and punishment for bad actors? That seems to be the way that politics moves in response to even just anecdotal problems. So I don't think we can expect that the federal government will continue to allow accreditors to do what I think accreditors mainly want their job to be, which is to work with institutions to improve, not to be sort of the scold or the principal. And I think since at least the mid-2000s, probably go further back than that, but at least the mid-2000s, we've seen that the federal government has said the accreditor's role should increasingly be about compliance and punishment. Doug mentioned the Spellings Commission. So again, we're talking about the mid-2000s. The goal was to establish a quote-unquote national strategy for higher education. They had this commissioned many papers. Many papers put accreditation sort of in the crosshairs to hold it responsible for many of the bad outcomes we had. The ultimate report that came from that commission certainly put responsibility on accreditors. And we've seen then that in this effort, and I think it was truly a well-intended effort, to root out lots of the waste and inefficiencies in higher education, said, look, accreditation has to become a lot more about compliance and conformity. Now, and that's a bad thing, certainly. I mean, I think our higher education system is really good relative to other systems in other countries, our K-12 system, because you do have a lot of independence for institutions. You can have a lot of innovation. You can have students who have different needs, different desires, finding institutions that specialize in those things. So you don't want this sort of uniformity. On the flip side, the Bush administration and to a large extent the Obama administration position was totally understandable. The sticker price of higher education, as we know, has skyrocketed for decades. Debt per student has increased markedly. You have large percentages of non-completers. There's lots of debate about how big it is, but you certainly have maybe a third. You could even have a half, depending on the numbers you look at, people who enter college who don't finish at least the program that they enter. Maybe they want individual courses. We don't have perfect information, but it's pretty reasonable to conclude we have a big non-completion problem. And then we have a major problem of underemployment for people who do complete. So about a third of people with a bachelor's degree are in a job that don't require that credential. So it's certainly not unreasonable to say there are big efficiency problems in higher education. And since it's the federal government allocating so much of the money, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, not unreasonably said, we now need to rein in all these excesses.